So let's use jQuery in a simple example and in fact re-implement what we did in raw JavaScript using jQuery so you can understand why it's a better solution. The first thing we're going to need is over in our index.html, we're going to need a new script line. Before our code gets executed here, we're going to need to bring in jQuery. And we can do that by writing another script tag. We'll see that Visual Studio is giving us the project structure of our www root so that we can build these URLs to these files a little easier. So I'll go down to lib, jQuery, and in the case of jQuery, it doesn't have the JavaScript files at its root. It has the source of jQuery, which might be useful for looking to see how it works, as well as a dist folder, which is fairly common in these scenarios, and that's a distribution folder. So say dist, and there we see the jQuery uncompressed version and then the compressed. And I'll go ahead and bring in the compressed version. Finish up the script tag. And now we can go back to our site, JavaScript, and let's use jQuery in here. jQuery exposes a single object to the global scope for use anywhere in these JavaScript files. And that global object is called jQuery. This jQuery is also aliased in the global scope as a $. This $, or jQuery, whichever way you want to write it, though most people write it as $, because it's short and more concise, exposes a number of methods for doing different things like making network calls and manipulating the UI. It's called jQuery because its whole purpose is to be able to query the document for individual elements. It does this using CSS selectors as a language for it. So if you remember back in our CSS file, we had selectors like body and label for getting element types by name. Then we had this pound syntax for IDs, and we had this dot syntax for classes. And that is the selector syntax that jQuery also uses. So what we can end up doing is we can replace this document.getByElementId with the jQuery syntax of $, and then parentheses, because what we're really doing is we're executing the jQuery function and passing in parameters. In this case, the parameters we're passing in is pound username, the CSS selector to find this object on the page. And why would we use this syntax? The reason is, as different browsers have small different variations in the way that their document object API works. It's getting closer and closer that all browsers do the same things, but that hasn't always been true. Problems of having browsers like the older IE versions or new browsers come in with different capabilities. jQuery was there to say, here, use our API and we'll handle the cross-browser, the multiple browser problem for you. We promise you that when you do $pound username, that regardless of what browser we're in, we're going to go find the element on the page with an ID of username. We're going to guarantee this for you. And this was a really important step in web development because before this, we had to test for what browser we were in and often write the same code 2, 3, or 4 times based on what browser we were using. Now the get element by ID, that was pretty ubiquitous. That was being used all over the place. But when you started to get into some of the small changes like inner HTML, because the spec was a little ambiguous, and in some cases the spec was written after the browser was written, in some browsers it is a inner HTML with all uppercase HTML like we see here. But in some browsers it was HTML. And in other browsers they were simply missing this and they had it in a different name. So we had this problem of which one do we use? Do we say, oh, this is an IE55 only website, which of course limits your customers? Do we check for the different versions of the browsers and do it multiple times? Or do we do something like using jQuery to make it simpler? And jQuery just says, I want to set the text of this object. And whatever browser I'm in, I'm going to guarantee that text is going to set the text inside of an element for me. If we look at this in the browser, unsurprisingly, we'll see that Sean Wildermuth still works. Still does what we expect it to. Events were another place where the different browsers could handle it in different ways. Often the same event had different names in different browsers. So again, we started using jQuery with their CSS selector syntax here to make this a little easier. And instead of saying on mouse enter, we actually call a method called on and use mouse enter as the name of the event, and then we're still using a function as a callback. Now, a couple of interesting things here is that you'll notice that on and text are both functions, and that's because it tries to make all of the types of calls having the same style of API. And in our case, this style of API is using function calls. So the first parameter is often some data, but the last parameter is almost always a callback of some sort. So we change this again. And this will make sure that our code is much more capable of running the same experience on different browsers. Now, of course, if all your customers are using the latest versions of Firefox and Chrome, this might not be necessary. But the reality is it's not true. Some of your customers are going to be on an Android tablet. Some of them are going to be on PCs that are new. Some of them are going to be on really old Windows XP with IE5 on them. And do you want to really serve all those clients or not? That's one of the purposes of jQuery. In both of these examples, the elements we're getting are returning single objects. The ID of username and the ID of main always are going to return one object because each item in a document must have a unique ID. If not, we're only going to end up returning one anyway because it's going to violate that rule. But it's different for CSS selectors that might return more than one value, like classes or even arbitrary CSS selectors. So let's create another one, and let's call this menu items. If we look at that HTML page, we remember that there is this menu unordered list that has some list items in it. We might want to handle when the list item anchor here is actually clicked. Now, if we had to have everything with an ID, we'd have to go through these and name them individually and then handle the event for each one of those, and that would be painful. So jQuery makes this simpler because we can use the syntax of ul.menu. So the unordered list with the class of menu, li for the list item, and a for the anchor. So we can do all of this to say we want to do something by storing the actual items, the actual anchors inside of this structure using the same CSS selector syntax. Because if we had decided in the CSS to format that, we would have done the same thing. In fact, we did some of that by saying menu li active, and we could have done menu li a color to change the color of the text. We certainly could have done that. So what do we do now that we have these menu items? How do we get at each one individually? We could look at menu items and check for the first one, the second one, the third one. But one of the geniuses of jQuery is that we can actually handle events on all of these using one callback. So if I say on click with a function that's calling back onto it, this will actually work by attaching an event to all these menu items all at once. Let's put a little alert in here and just say hello. To refresh it, when I click home, we can see hello is showing up. If I hit about, hello is showing up. If I hit contact, hello is showing up. And what this is doing is it's effectively taking our one function and wiring it up to the click of each of those elements on the page. It's not creating a new version of each function. It's more efficient than that, but it is saying that as long as you're clicking on one of these, we're okay. More interestingly is that we can actually get at the item that is being clicked. So in our case, we might want to show the text that's inside of the anchor inside of our alert. So let's do that. Now I can do that by wrapping the this pointer. Now this is represented the object that the function is related to. And by wrapping it in a $ parentheses, we're saying make this into a jQuery object for me, because I want to use jQuery to look at the object inside of this menu handler. And then I can just say me.text. Now remember, I use text up here to set the text, but if I don't include a parameter for the text, it returns the text that is contained in that element I'm looking at. And in our case, that'll be what's inside the anchor tag. With this change, if we refresh, when I click on home, it'll now show home because that's the text inside, or contact, which is the text inside, or about. Obviously, you shouldn't use alerts for our whole UI, but you can get a basic sense of this, of how it is supposed to work. So we've seen some basic things that jQuery can do. Let's use it to actually add some functionality to our page.